Introduction: how to have less crime and less punishment. Engineers have a sardonic saying: when brute force fails, you're not using enough. For 3 decades, in the face of the great crime wave that started in the early 1960s, we've been trying to solve our crime problem with brute force, building more and more prisons and jails. Recently, the crime problem has diminished, and this was written in 2009. Though the downward trend stopped around 2004, we still have a huge crime problem, to which we have now added a huge incarceration problem. There are now 2.3 million people behind bars at any one time, and that number continues to grow. Okay, is there an alternative to brute force? There is reason to think so, and pieces of that alternative approach can be seen working in scattered places throughout the world of crime control. But the first step in getting away from brute force is to want to get away from brute force, to care more about reducing crime than about punishing criminals, and to be willing to choose safety over vengeance when the two are in tension. And that's huge, the tension that he's talking about. Having safety and reducing crime versus having vengeance and punishing criminals. Those are two different perspectives. And he uses the word criminals, and I'm wondering what defines criminal, and he gets real deep into it later in the book, but this is just the introduction. If for a moment we thought about crime as something bad that happens to people, like auto accidents or air pollution or disease, rather than as something horrible that people do to each other, if we thought about it, that is, as an ordinary domestic policy problem, then we could start to ask how to limit the damage crime does at as little cost as possible in money spent and suffering inflicted. Again, this guy's totally into policy, so a lot of what he's talking about is addressing crime and punishment from a policy perspective, and a lot of that has to do with how to use public funds. So keep that in mind. Crime causes damage directly to victims and indirectly as people incur costs and impose costs on others to avoid victimization. The value of the total damage is hard to reckon, but serious estimates, even excluding white-collar crime, run as high as $1.4 trillion per year, more than 10% of GDP. Furthermore, this damage falls most heavily on the poor and socially marginal people least able to bear it. Crime not only concentrates around social disadvantage, but also sustains it, increasing costs for consumers and employers alike, and thereby driving away resources and opportunities. He explains that in more detail here in the introduction. One possible way to reduce the amount of crime is to detect, apprehend, convict, and punish criminals. This is one possible way. All 4 of those actions cost money. Currently, they cost about $200 billion per year nationwide, and do other kinds of harm, imposing suffering not only on those punished, but also on their families and friends. That the United States, with about 1% of its adults behind bars, now has the highest level of incarceration per capita in the world is not something to be proud of. Nor are the conditions of incarceration. Some of the defenders of torture at Abu Ghraib, Bagram, Guantanamo, and in the secret CIA prisons argued that what was being done to detainees abroad was no worse than what goes on all the time in domestic prisons. That was false. But it was closer to true than it ought to have been. 25,000 prisoners in the United States live in long-term solitary confinement in supermax prisons, and tens of thousands more in administrative segregation, sometimes for years on end. Prolonged isolation is one of the nastier ways of driving someone mad. And again, it goes back to what he was talking about, where are we looking at safety and reducing crime, or are we looking at vengeance and punishing criminals? The whole system is based on that separation of philosophy. Now, those harms too fall disproportionately to the lot of those already disadvantaged by poverty, social exclusion, and not least, crime itself. Criminals and victims are not two distinct populations. Many victims commit no crimes, but few criminals avoid victimization. Many victims commit no crimes, but few criminals avoid victimization. That's huge. And most of the criminals were victims before becoming perpetrators. Victimization is criminogenic. One way to frame the general problem of crime control policy is, and this is the big idea, what set of actions would result in the least total harm and cost from crime and crime control efforts combined? Neither across the board leniency nor maximum severity offers the right answer to that question. You can't be too easy and you can't be too severe. The right answer, as far as the operations of the criminal justice system are concerned, will use the minimum amount of punishment necessary to achieve any given level of crime control. That, in turn, requires that most punishments be swift and certain, rather than severe. Theory and evidence agree. Swift and certain punishment, even if not severe, will control the vast bulk of offending behavior. That means all those small crimes, severity doesn't need to be severe to stop all of those smaller mistakes and crimes and things like that. One problem with the brute force high severity approach is that severity is incompatible with swiftness and certainty. Severity means using a large share of punishment resources on a relatively few offenders, and as the American experience with capital punishment since its reintroduction illustrates, the more severe a sentence is, the more reluctantly it will be imposed, and the more due process, and therefore more time, it will require. The resources of the current criminal justice system matched against the volume of crime simply don't allow it to punish, even modestly, all offenses or all offenders. Trying to control everything and everyone, the tough-sounding zero tolerance approach, leads to sporadic and delayed punishments as the system overloads. The result is great quantities of punishment, much of it severe and effective control of nothing and no one except those actually behind bars. That's a bad bargain. That implies two additional design principles for enforcement regimes to add to the use of swiftness and certainty in place of severity. And this is the big idea. Concentration of resources and the direct communication of deterrent threats to likely offenders. Concentration exploits a central but poorly understood phenomenon, that positive feedback in rates of offending. He talks about that in chapter 4 in much more detail. But in a group of generally well-behaved individuals, enforcement can concentrate on a small number of miscreants. I like that he uses the word miscreants, delivering swift and certain sanctions, and the resulting high probability that any offense will lead to punishment will make misbehavior an unattractive option. He's talking about the majority of people that are doing things wrong, right? Swift, certain, takes care of the majority of them. But we're using severity, trying to use severity for all things, and it's not working. The same amount of enforcement attention applied to a badly behaved population will lead to only delayed and sporadic punishment, because the level of offending will swamp the enforcement response. As individuals learn that the most likely result of offending is getting away with it, offense rates will tend to rise, aggravating the inadequacy of the enforcement response. Both high and low levels of offending will be sustaining, and increases and decreases in offending levels will tend to be self-reinforcing. Positive feedback, the technical term for self-reinforcement, generates both of those vicious circles. Bad situations getting worse, and the opposite, what might be called virtuous circles. Sometimes both extremes are stable, but no place in the middle is stable. It's a tipping situation. Then the problem, once caught in a vicious circle, is how to move from the bad high violation equilibrium to the good low violation equilibrium. One way to do that is to add enforcement capacity so that it is possible to convincingly threaten even a large number of offenders. Since a low violation rate, once achieved, tends to be self-sustaining, it will not be necessary to maintain that additional capacity forever. You increase the resources, and as it starts to get good, with the swiftness and certainty, then you can start to detract from those resources. And that takes a level of self-control to government level. That's one of the challenges that he discusses. Okay. Once offenders have gotten the message, okay. One approach to finding those resources might be called, I love this phrase, dynamic concentration. Start somewhere with a geographic region, a set of offenses or a set of offenders. Borrow existing capacity from other areas, offenses or offenders, to concentrate on the chosen target. Once offenders have gotten the message that, in the words of the old music hall song, you can't do that there, here, that's a pretty old reference, I don't know what that is, and reduced their level of activity accordingly, once that original target has been tipped from high offending to low offending, the temporary increase in enforcement directed at that sector can be relaxed without letting the target tip back. That frees up those extra resources for a new target, which tips in turn. Only at that point will it be true that achieving more compliance will require inflicting more punishment. Right now, the US criminal justice system is a long way from that point. We could have much less crime and many fewer people behind bars than we do now, simply by applying dynamic concentration. Simply, of course, in concept only. Actually doing it is hard. He keeps accounting for the fact that this is policy, and policy is hard because humans. The cost of tipping a high violation situation to the alternative low violation equilibrium depends on how quickly offenders respond to the new level of deterrence. That transition cost can be reduced to the benefit of law enforcement and offenders alike by warning offenders in advance. Actual crime control, unlike the playground game of cops and robbers, is not a zero-sum game, where any gain to one side must reflect a loss on the other. Since punishment, as opposed to the crime reduction punishment intends to bring about, since punishment is a cost, not a benefit, to the public, officials who design and carry out crime control efforts share a common interest with the people whose behavior they are trying to control. Both sides would gain by reducing the level of punishment. And that's where you get that non-zero sum game reference. It's really important because a lot of people do think that winning means somebody else loses. But there's a way for everyone to win a little bit, even if somebody wins a little bit more. That could be the very best option for everybody if everyone recognizes that trying to get more equal will end up resulting in a much more unfair result. Okay, so that makes it in the interest of real cops as opposed to playground cops to warn potential lawbreakers of the consequence of lawbreaking. In some situations, the warnings alone can do most of the work, but they need to be backed up with the capacity to deliver on the threat when necessary. As any parent knows, a warning that turns out to be a bluff devalues future warnings. And it's funny because a lot of the arguments in current times at the moment is the crimes aren't just being committed by the public. The laws and the rules that are governing those that are supposed to watch over the rules of the public need themselves something to watch over them and make this happen as well. So it's not just cops and bad guys and perps. That's not it. It's not limited to that range. So the same principles that apply to controlling the behavior of actual and potential offenders in general apply, but even with greater force, to controlling the behavior of offenders under community supervision, parolees under supervision after incarceration, probationers under supervision instead of incarceration, and those released on bail or their own recognizance, I love that word, while awaiting trial, a special case given that they are still presumed innocent. As things stand, the community corrections system reproduces the flaws of the larger criminal justice system, having more rules than it can reliably enforce and imposing sporadic, but sometimes severe sanctions. A parent who acted the way the probation system acts, letting most misconduct go unpunished, but occasionally lashing out with ferocious punishments, would be called both neglectful and abusive. A small set of rules, each clearly linked to the goal of the reducing reoffending, and adequate capacity to monitor whether those rules are being observed, and a system of swift, reliable, and proportionate sanctions to back up those rules would perform much better. If we can make community corrections a genuine alternative to incarceration. In other words, if we can learn how to punish people and control their behavior when not paying for their room and board, we can have less crime and less incarceration to the benefit of victims and offenders alike. Last page. The good news is that programs embodying these principles are beginning to spring up around the country and in all parts of the criminal justice enterprise. Hope, Ceasefire, and High Point aren't yet celebrity ideas, but they deserve to be. Again, this was written in 2009. Of course, crime levels respond to factors other than punishment. Both social services and social reforms can reduce crime. This is talked about in Chapter 7. And when everyone's talking about defunding the police, they don't mean defunding the police and just throwing the money in the air. They're talking about addressing these mental health services, social services that aren't funded enough. So please keep that in mind. And if you want to talk about that point, please DM me. Okay. So not every social program or reform, not even every worthwhile one, is crime reducing, since a relatively small number of people account for a very large proportion of all crime. Broadly distributed social services have low target efficiency as crime control measures. For example, since high school dropouts have higher crime rates, on average, than people from similar social backgrounds who manage to graduate, it makes sense that improving educational outcomes, especially for students from high crime neighborhoods, would tend to reduce crime. But there is no convincing evidence that increasing spending on public education by 10% would actually improve educational outcomes enough to measurably reduce crime, while 10% of the public education budget is more than a quarter of the total criminal justice budget. So while there are many good reasons to want to improve K-12 education, it is unlikely to be a cost-effective means of crime control. There are things that non-crime control agencies can do to reduce crime. Many of them with much more effect per dollar spent than routine criminal justice activities. Some of them do not even cost money. If high school classes started at 10 a.m. rather than 8 a.m. and ended at 5 p.m. instead of 3 p.m., after school crime would be greatly reduced. And there is no reason to think that preschool crime, preschool, before school, would rise correspondingly. But since no one thinks to blame the school superintendent for after-school burglaries, school systems face no pressure to make the change. Similarly, teaching a first grade teacher techniques of classroom order maintenance demonstrably improves not only learning, but also pupils' behavior outside the classroom well into adolescence, if not beyond. He has a reference here, but I'm just going to go ahead and say that the culture of schools, especially in early elementary, there's such a myriad of issues involved in behavior management, classroom management, and from classroom to classroom, how some teachers have a very authoritarian, some sort of saying they're authoritative, others being very laissez-faire about classroom management. The differences are so wide from classroom to classroom that is definitely a problem that, if addressed, would do what Mark Kleiman is saying. Only social programs that are either very cheap or very effective are likely to be worth doing universally for their crime control benefits alone. But it is not very hard to spot people, even fairly young children, whose behavior and social circumstances mark them out as high risk for criminal activity. The ranks of serious and persistent adult offenders are drawn largely from juveniles with records of misconduct in school and a succession of increasingly serious juvenile arrests. Most of those active juvenile offenders will not develop into high crime rate adults, but enough of them will do so to warrant targeting them in crime prevention efforts. Services that would not be cost effective as crime control, if scattered, may look much more attractive if focused on those most likely to become serious criminals when they grow up. Okay, on the other hand, because crime is so very expensive, any modesticized social program with measurable crime control benefits is likely to pay for itself many times over. Positive feedbacks in the system create synergies between social programs and enforcement programs. Reductions in crime due to social programs increase the efficacy of the law enforcement system by reducing the number of crimes competing for enforcement attention. Nurse home visits for expectant mothers, high quality preschool programs, and perhaps even Head Start, and reducing children's exposure to lead have all demonstrated that they can reduce crime, some of them quite spectacularly compared to their costs. And again, chapter 70 talks a lot about that. Yet social service programs get very little attention in the discussion of how to control crime, and crime control benefits tend to be peripheral to the way such programs are designed and evaluated. The bad news, and this is the last paragraph, is that current policies leave us with unnecessarily and unforgivably high levels of both crime and incarceration. The good news is that the knowledge of how to do better grows from year to year. This book is intended to push that learning process one step forward and to help create public pressure for public agencies to do what is needed to shrink both the crime problem and the population behind bars. That's the introduction. This book it's intense. Even if you skim through topic headings of paragraphs and go through each chapter and just sort of skim through, it's a ridiculously important book, even 11 years old. I've actually used the premise in this book to reduce behavior problems at my last school, with especially the middle schoolers. It was a K-12 campus. And I applied some of these principles as a third grade teacher with a self-directed learning classroom. And while the school was trying to focus on severity, on all crimes, misbehaviors, I offered this approach and focused new resources, basically my time, and focused them primarily on a zero tolerance policy on a small group of students. And in doing that, I was able to have them come to my classroom whenever they made a mistake in the classroom, and they came to me not for any sort of punishment, because I told them right up front that I had no authority over them, but I allowed them to speak. I allowed them to be heard. I provided them feedback. I provided them guidance. I let them work with some kiddos, and I coached them on how to work with little kids. And I gave them social support, and once a week I would meet with all the kids and we would talk about certain social emotional character development skills and concepts. And we would talk about these things. And so that small percentage, single percent of students that all the teachers agreed that, yeah, every time they're in a classroom, blah, 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 send them to me. And by focusing on that resource, that social development, that emotional intelligence, conceptual understanding on that population, I ended up having them bringing other students that weren't on that initial list of students that teachers are having trouble with, because they also wanted to learn these things. And that leads me to further support the ideas that he's talking about, that it's not just one thing, it's a system of mechanisms that if you address all of them with a philosophy that you're trying to reduce crime instead of increase punishment, the solutions that you come up with, they're gonna work. So again, when brute force fails, oh yeah, it's up, here it is. And yeah, this is all part of my effort to share more books and ideas about possible solutions. So that was a long one. All right, I'm out.